Welcome to Natural History. I'm going to read a little more about Whitefoot. I thought you might want to get some comic paper if you have any, or draw some squares. You may have started this last week and you can just add on to the story. So when I finish reading today, maybe you would get that out and continue Whitefoot's story using comic paper to show where she is. So I know we left her there's a picture. She was in trouble. This was the last paragraph we read. Later, as the water deepened beneath Whitefoot's log, a muskrat swam by at the point of the V it made along the surface. It dived, and for a second only its tail was in sight, curved like a question mark, and then the tail too disappeared. Whitefoot could not fly and did not wish to swim, floated among trees again as the wind pushed her log out toward the river. Except for shivering, she did not move. She only watched as the log floated and nudged against obstacles and paused and turned and floated on. If you'd seen her, you might have thought she was being patient. She was capable of patience, I think, but now she was simply doing nothing, which was all there was to do. Her log did not touch land again or any larger log. It did not bump against anything that she might have climbed onto. It went slowly along, moving away from the wind, and the motions it made gave Whitefoot the floating feeling that was new to her. This feeling kept her alert. She was not going to get used to it. A change of light came over her, for the wind had shoved her log finally out into the open river. Such a length of sky as Whitefoot had never seen opened suddenly above her between the two long lines of trees standing in deep water on what had been the river's banks. Now the water beneath her log was swift and troubled, not only by the wind, but by the 100 different shifts and whirls of the current. The light came down on the water, and the water flung it upward again, filling the air with quick gleams and reflections. Now, all around her, in addition to the sound of the rain falling on the water and the wind in the branches, was the louder sound of the swift current slurring past the trunks of the trees. In the river, the log was less pushed by the wind than carried along by the moving water. It's easy to think of a flowing river as having one current, but actually the current is made of many currents, flowing at different speeds and in different directions, crisscrossing, whirling, braiding together. At first, Whitefoot's log drifted by itself, the currents turning it as they carried it on, but when the motions of water and wind had moved it out into the channel, the main force of the flow, it began to be accompanied by other floating things, by the rubble of woods and fields, and by human rubbish, twigs and leaves, bits of dried grass, corn stalks, sticks, scraps of lumber cans and bottles, logs, tree limbs, pieces of plastic, foam barrels, old tires, a basketball, whole trees. These things whirled along separately or in large mats of drift that were like floating rugs. These mats gathered sometimes until they were many feet across, until they were rafts, and then the currents tore or whirled them apart. Then they were regathered into new shapes, but some were more tightly bound together by logs or by the trunks and limbs of large trees. Finally, it happened that Whitefoot's log was caught up into one of these, a raft of drift held together by the roots and sprawling branches of an old water maple that had been released by a collapsing bank upstream. Though its surface lifted and fell with the motions of the water, and though it was constantly fraying at the edges, because of the big tree, this raft of drift was more sturdy than most. It was like a floating island. Several golden-eyed blackbirds were confidently walking on it, feeding and looking around. I don't believe Whitefoot would have thought of initiating of imitating the birds whose long spreading toes held them up on their floating shaft as securely as if it were solid ground, and who anyhow could fly to safety if they needed to. I think Whitefoot merely knew that her own small feet needed something more solid. She did not move, though if she could have done so, she would have climbed upward, away from the terrible nearness of the water. When the rain quit, the surface of the river became glossy, littered with scraps and splinters of reflected light. When the rain dashed down again, the folds and ripples of the surface roughened like goose flesh. All the rest of the day, while the risen water carried her maybe 15 miles, Whitefoot did not move. She had come from the solid, familiar world of her home acre into this strange, never-resting world of water and air and light, where everything was changing all the time. She was wet and cold and bewildered and frightened, and she knew that all the safety she had was in keeping still. For a while, several coots fed eagerly, tipping and diving among the mats of drift, and where the river flowed past the submerged creek mouth, a family of otters was traveling upstream through the quieter wave, looping through the surface as they went. Whitefoot's eyes lingered on nothing. As the river carried and turned her, she saw what she saw. In the late afternoon, the light changed around her again as she passed out of the mouth of the first river and entered a much wider one. As the currents carried her flimsy island out into the mid-channel of the larger river, Whitefoot felt that she was in a world entirely watery and flowing. The trees of the shorelines and bottomlands were far on either side and were veiled by mist and the falling rain. Whitefoot's eyes, used to the enclosed world of the woods where she had always lived, could hardly see so far. She could hardly know that way off beyond the edges of the water the land still rose up firm. All she knew now was the moving water, the shifting light on the water, the rain, and the wind. The wind was driving large waves upstream against the flowing of the river. The mat of drift rose and fell as the waves fell under it. The voice in Whitefoot's mind cried, "Look out! Look out!" But there was nothing to do, no place to go, no dry hole to creep into and be safe and get dry and grow warm and go to sleep. She clung, hunched down and shivering, to the little log as it tilted over the waves, seeing only the great light and the turning, swaying drift. As evening came, the wind ceased and the water slowly became smoother. A little comfort came to Whitefoot, though she was still wet and cold and frightened. She was hungry, too, and now as the day darkened and the night rose into the eastward mist, she was coming to her waking time. It was time to be up and about. If you'd been there and were able to see in the dark, you would have seen Whitefoot change as night fell onto the river. She changed from a small, huddled animal who might as well have been asleep to an animal altogether awake. Her eyes that had been seeing only the daylight and the moving river showed her now had purpose in them, and they were looking. Her ears were listening into the slur and spatter around her. Her nose was intelligently sniffing. Even her whiskers had grown alert. Though she had not yet moved, she was clearly an animal ready to move. The voice in her mind was saying, "Seeds, seeds, look around." Even if you could see in the dark, you'd have to look fast to see her move. You would have seen her in the middle of her log, and then you would have seen her at one of the ends of it, and then you would have seen her in several stops on the way to the other end. She was moving in darts and starts, as always. It would have seemed to you as if she simply disappeared in one place and appeared in another. She'd begun her nightly hunt for food, and she needed to escape from her log, where she had found not a thing to eat. At the end of the log she first went to, there was nothing that could support even her little weight, just a thin, flimsy, soggy carpet of floating grass and leaves and small twigs. When she got to the other end, a wave caused her log to bump against something that her senses told her was solid. It was an old tire, and she leapt onto it. With the same small darts and starts as before, she made her way around the tire and then perhaps 2/3 of the way around again. She leapt onto a broken oar, and from there to a one-armed plastic doll, and from there to another log. She explored the length of this new log and found that it reached into what had once been the top of the old water maple itself. Whitefoot leaped again and grappled her way among the branches. As she climbed about, she propped and balanced herself with her tail. The flower buds of the old tree were fattening, ready to break into bloom. Whitefoot paused here and there to nibble these as she made her way from thin branch to branches that became stouter as she got nearer to the main trunk. Once she'd reached a sturdy branch and was traveling along it toward the trunk, she understood that she was safer than she had been before. The great tree moved with the current, but the big waves did not affect it much. The small ones, not at all. Okay, see if you can go do some drawing from that story. Come, peace to your day.